Good afternoon, folks. Now I have discussion C for you. We are discussing, title is The Brain That Changes and the Caregiver Who Stays. Okay? Here we go. Dementia does not enter a home quietly. It arrives like a slow-moving storm, subtle at first, then unmistakable, and with it comes a second parallel journey. The caregivers. While the disease dismantles neural networks, the caregiver builds new ones in real time. Improvising structure, safety, and meaning as the brain of the person they love begins to slip away. Families often describe dementia in terms of what the patient loses, but the fuller story, the one caregivers live, is about what they carry. The emotional labor, the cognitive load, the vigilance, the grief, and the fierce devotion that keeps the world intact for someone whose brain is losing its ability to hold on to it. This is the story of that parallel journey. When the brain begins to slip, dementia begins long before symptoms appear. Proteins misfold, blood vessels narrow, neurons lose their ability to communicate. But caregivers experience those microscopic changes as human moments, a repeated question, a forgotten birthday, a misplaced accusation, a sudden fear of being alone. These early signs reflect injury to the hippocampus, the brain's memory hub, and to the entorhinal cortex, the gateway between memory and perception. But caregivers don't see neurons dying. They see a spouse asking what time is it? What time is dinner? 5 times in an hour. They see a mother who suddenly can't remember how to make her signature soup. The caregiver becomes the first responder to the brain's quiet unraveling, noticing patterns, compensating for gaps, and beginning the long work of adaptation. The emotional weight of watching identity shift as dementia speeds into the frontal lobes. Personality begins to change. This is the part caregivers feel most accurately because it alters the emotional landscape of the relationship. A gentle father becomes irritable. A private mother becomes disinhibited. A spouse who once soothed a spouse who once soothed becomes suspicious of withdrawn. These changes are not choices. They are neurological consequences of damage to the brain's regulatory systems. But caregivers feel them as relational earthquakes. They lose the version of the person they knew long before they lose the person entirely. This is where grief begins, not at the end of life, but in the slow erosion of personality, empathy, and shared history. The caregiver's brain consistent adaptation. Caregiving for dementia is not just physical labor. It it is cognitive labor. The caregiver's brain becomes an extension of the patient's, compensating for deflects, anticipating needs, and creating external scaffolding for a brain that can no longer organize itself. Caregivers become the memory the patient can no longer access, the frontal lobe that provides judgment and impulse control, the translator of confusing behaviors, the protector against risks the patient cannot perceive. They learn to interpret new behaviors through a neurological lens, understanding that wandering, agitation, repetition, or withdrawal are symptoms of brain injury, not intention. They become experts in interpreting dementia behaviors, anticipating needs, and creating routines that stabilize a world. The disease is destabilizing. This cognitive load is why dementia caregiving feels exhausting even before the physical tasks intensify. The caregiver is doing the mental work of two people, the loneliness of loving someone who's who is changing. Dementia caregiving is marked by a particular kind of loneliness, one that comes from loving someone who is slowly becoming unfamiliar. Caregivers grieve conversations that no longer happen, shed memories that only one person remembers, personality traits that fade, the future that will not unfold as imagined. This grief is ambiguous because the person is still here and anticipatory because the caregiver knows what is coming. It is grief without rituals, without casseroles, without condolences. It is grief carried in silence, often unnoticed by others. And yet, caregivers continue, not because they are unbreakable, but because love becomes a form of endurance. When recognition fades, the moment a parent or spouse no longer recognizes their caregiver is often described as the hardest part of the disease. But neurologically, it is the predictable result of widespread damage to the hippocampus, amygdala, and association corticals. Recognition is not just memory, it is visual processing, emotional tagging, identity integration. Relationship mapping. When these circuits fail, the caregiver becomes a nice woman, a helper, or someone familiar but not known. But here is the truth. Caregivers need to know here the relationship exists, the love exists, the disease erased access to it, not its history. The caregiver becomes the keeper of the relationship's memory, holding it for both people. When the brain can no longer do the work, what caregivers preserve? Even as dementia dismantles neural networks, caregivers preserve what the disease cannot touch: dignity, safety, comfort, ritual, connection, presence. They become the guardians of humanity, protecting the person's identity even as the brain loses its ability to express it. Caregivers often say, I lost them in pieces, but they also love them in pieces. Fiercely, consistently, and without the brain's help. The quiet heroism, the quiet heroism of dementia caregiving. Dementia caregiving is not loud. It is not celebrated. It is rarely received. It rarely receives the support it deserves, but it is one of the most profound acts of human devotion. It is choosing to stay when the brain of the person you love can no longer stay with you. It is loving someone whose identity is shifting, whose memories are dissolving, whose personality is changing. It is holding on to the relationship even when the disease has let go. Caregivers do not just witness dementia, they absorb it, they counterbalance it, they soften it, they humanize it, and in doing so, they protect something essential: the dignity of a person whose brain is disappearing, but whose humanity remains. Okay, guys, I'll be back on with D as soon as I take a little break for myself. And I will see everybody shortly for D. Until then, Gator Wellness, take care.